November 23rd, 1848, Georgia. The air is sharp, damp with autumn's last breath. The fields are stiff with frost. The soil grey under a low and heavy sky. Thanksgiving morning, a day of prayer for some, a day of labor for most, a day of hunger for many. Sarah, that was her name. The name whispered in kitchens. The name spoken in hushed tones long after the fire burned down. She was 23 years old, born in chains, born to Ruth, who was worked to death by the age of 30, born beside Samuel, her younger brother who was sold south when he was 11, Sarah, whose life was never hers, Sarah, who cooked but never ate, Sarah, who carried bruises not of her own making. She was small, thin shoulders but hard from lifting pots and grinding corn, her skin the deep brown of turned soil, her hands scarred from hot irons, from burns she was never allowed to treat, her face narrow, sharp, a gaze that cut through silence. She spoke little. When she did, her words carried weight. The plantation was called Oak Hill, though there were more fields than trees, more pain than shade. The owners, the Prescott family, were not always present. They left the land in the hands of their overseers, 7 men, 7 names Sarah never forgot. Henry, Thomas, Wade, Elijah, Robert, Silas, John. They worked the enslaved from dawn to dusk. Their boots struck the ground like whips, their voices harsh with commands. They punished with belts, with sticks, with fire-heated irons. They drank whiskey from tin cups and spat tobacco into the dirt. They laughed loud, but never laughed with the enslaved, only at them. The kitchen was Sarah's cage. She lived in its smoke. She woke before light, lit the fire, ground the corn, boiled the beans. She stirred stews that would never fill her belly. She baked pies whose crust she was forbidden to taste. Thanksgiving was always the cruelest, because Thanksgiving was not a feast for her people. It was a spectacle, a parade of abundance for those who starved others. Sarah and the other kitchen girls roasted turkeys until their skin crackled, glazed hams until the fat ran sweet, mashed potatoes until they were smooth as cream, pumpkin pies, molasses cakes, biscuits brushed with butter, sweet corn pudding. The smells filled the house, taunted the enslaved who could only smell, never touch. This year, the overseers prepared to sit at the long pine table inside the Prescott dining hall. The owners were gone, celebrating elsewhere. The overseers had the run of Oak Hill. They strutted, they boasted, they demanded the best. "Make it finer than last year," Henry barked. "I want a table that shines." Sarah bowed her head. She whispered, "Yes, sir." But inside, her heart beat like a drum. The 7 men would gather that evening. They would eat. They would drink. They would brag about their power, about their control, about their cruelties. Sarah knew the pattern. She had served them before. She knew the way Wade picked his teeth with a knife. She knew the way Robert demanded extra gravy. She knew the way John slapped the serving girls if they moved too slow. But Sarah had changed. Something in her had hardened like iron left too long in the fire. Something that refused to cool. Her silence was not emptiness. Her silence was a weapon. Every stir of the spoon, every glance at the fire, every careful movement of her hands was sharpening her resolve. Because Sarah remembered. She remembered the cries of her mother, Ruth, coughing blood in the fields, still forced to work until her body collapsed. She remembered Samuel being dragged away, screaming her name until his voice broke, sold to a trader who carried him south. She remembered nights of hunger when she licked the bottom of the pot for scraps. She remembered the taste of ashes more than food. The overseers thought she was nothing, a shadow in the kitchen, a pair of hands, a girl with no voice. But Sarah was more. She was memory. She was silence sharpening into a blade. That Thanksgiving, as the frost melted into mud outside, the kitchen smelled of roasted turkey. But beneath it, something else. Something bitter. Something metallic. A smell the overseers did not know. A smell Sarah had come to know too well. Rat poison, they called it. Powder bought to kill vermin, kept in a tin in the storage room. Forgotten by most, not forgotten by Sarah. She had seen its effect. Not on rats. On a dog once, strayed too close, licked at the wrong bowl. She had watched it seize foam collapse. The overseers had cursed. Sarah had watched. And she had remembered. The powder was not for rats, not for pests. It was for men. Sarah's hands trembled when she first touched the tin. Not from fear, from the weight of what she held. She looked at it by candlelight, the white dust clinging to her fingers. She thought of her mother. She thought of Samuel. She thought of silence. She whispered their names: Ruth, Samuel, Sarah. The feast would come. The overseers would eat, and Sarah would serve them. But not with obedience, not with submission. She would serve them with memory, with silence, with fire. That morning, the other kitchen girls chattered softly, fearful of the overseer's demands. Sarah stayed quiet. She chopped onions until her eyes burned. She salted the turkey. She brushed the crust of pies with milk. And when no one looked, she reached for the tin. She stirred it into the gravy, into the pudding, into the pies. She stirred until the spoon clicked against the pot like a clock counting down. Sarah didn't cry. She didn't pray. She just stirred. Outside, the sky darkened with early winter clouds. The overseers laughed in the yard, their boots heavy on the frozen ground. The enslaved bent their backs in the fields, cutting stalks, hauling wood. Smoke curled from the kitchen chimney. The table inside the hall gleamed with candles. Plates set, silver polished. Wine poured. The 7 men entered: Henry, Thomas, Wade, Elijah, Robert, Silas, John. They sat. They laughed. They demanded food, and Sarah carried it in dish by dish, her face still, her silence sharp. The table had never been so full. Not because of bounty, not because of blessing, but because every dish carried more than food. Every dish carried Sarah's memory. Every dish carried her silence. Every dish carried vengeance. This was the setup. This was the moment before the storm. This was the breath before the strike. Sarah had stirred. Sarah had prepared. Sarah had turned Thanksgiving into something else entirely. Not a feast, a reckoning. Sarah did not become Sarah of the feast in one night. No, that kind of fire is not born in a single moment. It is fed. It is fanned. It is carved into bone across years. She was born in the year 1825, on the very soil of Georgia, on the very plantation called Oak Hill. Born not into freedom, but into ownership. Born not into family, but into property. The first sounds she heard were not lullabies, but commands. The first hands to touch her were not tender, but inspecting. Her mother was Ruth. Ruth, the woman who worked bent over the cotton fields with a child tied to her back. Ruth, whose skin was scored with scars, each one a story. Ruth, who whispered hymns into Sarah's ears at night, soft and trembling, words of a God who saw everything, even when men pretended he did not. Sarah loved her mother. She loved the smell of her skin, salt and earth. She loved the sound of her voice, low and steady, even when pain twisted it. Ruth would hum as she braided Sarah's hair by the flicker of a tallow candle. She would murmur, "Hold still, child. The world will try to break you. Don't let them see you bend." But Ruth bent because she had to. She bent under the weight of cotton sacks. She bent under the fists of overseers. She bent until her spine would not straighten anymore. And one winter, when Sarah was only 12, Ruth bent into the earth itself, buried in a shallow grave behind the quarters. No marker, no stone, only Sarah's memory. Her brother was Samuel. Samuel, younger by 2 years. Samuel, quick with a laugh that made even shadows feel less heavy. Samuel, who could run faster than anyone. Samuel, who would steal apples when he could, and press them into Sarah's hand with a grin. "Eat, sister. Don't tell." Samuel dreamed of running north. He whispered to Sarah of rivers that led to freedom, of men and women who could read, of towns where no one owned another soul. Sarah wanted to believe. She wanted to follow. But when Samuel was 11, the overseer Wade pointed at him and said, "That one fetches a good price." Sarah watched as her brother was dragged to the trading post. She watched his wrists tied with rope. She watched his eyes search for hers, wide, wet, desperate. She heard his voice breaking, screaming her name. "Sarah, Sarah." She screamed back until her throat tore, but the wagon rolled south. The dust swallowed him. Samuel was gone. Sarah never saw him again, only in her dreams, only in her memory, only in her silence. The overseers, Henry, Thomas, Wade, Elijah, Robert, Silas, John, were not just names. They were wounds. Each man carved his cruelty into Sarah's life in different ways. Henry, the one with the sharp tongue, who mocked her mother's coughing until Ruth spat blood. Thomas, who took the bread she baked and tossed it in the dirt if it wasn't golden enough. Wade, who sold Samuel south. Elijah, who struck her across the mouth when she spilled a ladle of stew. Robert, who made sport of chasing her with a whip just to watch her flinch. Silas, who drank himself to rage and turned fists on whoever was closest. John, who cornered her once in the smokehouse until another slave's footsteps made him stop. Each name a scar, each man a memory. Sarah remembered every detail. She remembered Henry's yellow teeth when he grinned. She remembered Thomas's red face when he shouted. She remembered Wade's hands thick as knots of wood. She remembered Elijah's boots, polished while he kicked others down. She remembered Robert's laugh, shrill and cruel. She remembered Silas's smell of whiskey and sweat. She remembered John's breath, sour, heavy, close. She remembered, and memory hardened into iron. They told her she was nothing, that her body was theirs, that her silence was proof of her weakness. But Sarah's silence was not weakness. It was storage. It was a vessel. It was where she kept Ruth's voice, where she kept Samuel's laughter, where she kept every insult, every slap, every hunger pang. Sarah grew into the kitchen. That was her world. By 14, she was grinding corn at dawn, stirring pots taller than her chest. By 16, she was roasting whole hogs for the overseers, her face flushed from fire, her eyes dry from smoke. By 20, she was known as the best cook on the plantation. Not praised, not rewarded, simply expected. Food became her language. She understood the way spices covered bitterness, the way salt lifted flavor, the way sugar masked what lay beneath. She learned how to feed men until their bellies swelled. She learned how to serve without tasting. She learned how to give without ever receiving. But food was also her memory. She remembered her mother's cornbread, burnt at the edges, soft at the center. She remembered Samuel's stolen apples. She remembered scraps passed around the quarters at night, laughter filling bellies even when food could not. And food became her weapon. Because Sarah understood something the overseers did not. What goes into the body can also undo it. One winter evening, when Sarah was 17, she saw Silas set out rat poison in the barn. A white powder poured into a dish of milk. She watched a rat scurry, lap, then thrash, legs kicking, body stiffening. She watched its tiny chest stop. Silas spat and muttered, "Vermin gone." But Sarah did not see vermin. She saw possibility. She saw a tool, not for rats, not for pests, for men. The thought frightened her at first. She pushed it away. But it returned again and again, whenever the overseers struck, whenever they mocked, whenever they laughed over her mother's grave, whenever she remembered Samuel's voice fading into dust. The thought became a seed. The seed became a root. The root became a tree. And so Sarah carried wounds, wounds of loss, wounds of hunger, wounds of humiliation, wounds of silence. But silence was not empty. Silence was full, full of Ruth, full of Samuel, full of fire. Years passed. Sarah worked. Sarah watched. Sarah remembered. The overseers grew more arrogant. They boasted of their power. They drank louder. They mocked the enslaved with sharper tongues. They prepared for Thanksgiving feasts with greed in their eyes. And Sarah waited. She waited through long summers, fields white with cotton. She waited through autumns, smoke thick in the air. She waited through winters, cold cutting into skin. She waited through springs, mud swallowing feet. She waited with silence. She waited with memory. She waited with poison in her mind. The promise of freedom never came. The lie of mercy never arrived. The overseers kept their boots on necks. The Prescotts kept their backs turned. The Quarters kept their voices hushed. Sarah's heart hardened. Her silence sharpened. Her memory burned. And by 1848 she was ready. Not because she stopped mourning, but because mourning had turned to steel. Not because she stopped remembering, but because remembering had become her weapon. Not because she stopped fearing, but because fear no longer mattered. 7 names, 7 overseers, 7 wounds. Henry, Thomas, Wade, Elijah, Robert, Silas, John. 1 for her mother, 1 for her brother. 1 for every scar, 1 for every hunger pang. 1 for every night without sleep. 1 for every insult. 1 for every prayer unanswered. Sarah did not cry. Sarah did not bend. Sarah did not break. Sarah remembered. And memory was enough. It was not one wound that broke Sarah. It was not one blow, one word, one insult. It was the weight of years stacked like stones on her back. But there was a moment, a final straw that cracked silence into action. Autumn 1848. The leaves had turned brown and brittle. The nights grew long. The overseers grew restless, loud with whiskey and pride. The Prescotts, the owners, had left Oak Hill to celebrate Thanksgiving in Savannah. That left the 7 overseers to rule unchecked. 7 men, 7 egos, 7 cruelties multiplied without restraint. That week, Sarah had been ordered to prepare for the largest feast Oak Hill had ever seen. "Make it shine," Henry barked. "I want the table sagging under food," Thomas laughed. "And if it don't, we'll have her back working till dawn." Silas slammed his cup down. "Better not burn a thing this year. I'll make her eat the ashes if she does." Their laughter filled the kitchen doorway. Sarah kept her eyes down. Her hands worked, chopping, stirring, cleaning, but inside her silence burned. The breaking point came 3 nights before Thanksgiving. Sarah had stayed awake long past midnight, preparing bread for the feast. She kneaded dough with sore arms, sweat running down her back, firelight flickering against the walls. Her mind wandered to Samuel. Where was he now? Was he alive? Did he remember her name? The kitchen door slammed open. It was Robert, drunk, his boots heavy on the floor. He staggered toward her, his breath sour with whiskey. "You still up, girl?" He sneered. "You work harder than any of us. Maybe you deserve a reward." Sarah stiffened. His shadow fell across her. His hand reached out, rough fingers brushing her arm. She pulled away, clutching the dough like a shield. He laughed. "Feisty, ain't you?" "That's all right. I like feisty." Her stomach turned. Her silence shook. She whispered, "Please, sir, let me finish the bread." But Robert didn't care for bread. He leaned closer, his grin wide, his hand reaching again. Then a noise. Boots on the porch outside. Elijah's voice calling, "Robert, you drinking yourself blind again?" Robert cursed, spat on the floor and stumbled out, muttering, "Another night then." Sarah stood frozen, her chest heaving. The dough sagged in her hands. Her silence was no longer just silence. It was rage. It was resolve. That was the moment. The moment her memory became decision. The moment her grief became weapon. The moment her silence became a vow. She would not wait for freedom promised by others. She would not pray for rescue from men who never came. She would not hope for mercy from overseers who had none. She would carve her own reckoning, with her own hands, with her own tools. The plan began forming in her mind. Not shouted, not written, silent, precise. She knew the overseers' habits. She knew their hunger, their greed. She knew they would eat whatever she placed before them, and they would eat plenty. She knew the rat poison in the storage room, the tin with its bitter dust. She knew how easily powder dissolved in gravy, how sugar masked bitterness in pudding, how spices covered the metallic edge in meat pies. The weapon was not a knife, not a whip, not fire. The weapon was food. The weapon was memory. The weapon was her silence. In the days before Thanksgiving, Sarah prepared. She worked as she always did, but with new eyes, new hands. She polished the tin pots until they gleamed like mirrors. Not because she cared for shine, but because she could see her reflection. She whispered to it, "Ruth, Samuel, I will not forget you." She sharpened knives, though not for cutting meat. She sharpened them to remind herself of edges, of precision, of danger hidden in plain sight. She stirred sauces slowly, watching the swirl, imagining the poison dissolving, invisible, unstoppable. At night, when the kitchen was empty, she slipped into the storage room. She found the tin. She pried it open. White powder clung to the edges, faintly bitter in the air. She dipped her finger, tasted a grain. The bitterness burned her tongue. She spat it out, coughing but smiling through the tears. "This," she whispered, "is not for me. It is for them." She carried the tin back to her pallet in the corner of the kitchen. She hid it beneath rags. She dreamed of Samuel that night. In her dream, he was running, but this time he was not caught. This time he was free. This time he turned and smiled at her. The days blurred. The overseers barked more orders. They demanded pies, puddings, turkeys, hams. Sarah obeyed, but inside every demand was fuel. Every insult was a match. The other kitchen girls noticed her silence deepening. "Sarah, you all right?" one asked, eyes wide. Sarah only nodded. She did not speak. Words could betray her. Silence could not. On the morning of Thanksgiving, she rose before dawn. Frost clung to the windows. The fire cracked alive in the hearth. She laid out the ingredients: flour, sugar, eggs, butter, milk, and then the tin. She held it in her hands. It was light. Too light for the weight it carried. She opened it, stared at the white dust inside. Her heart thudded. Her breath slowed. "This," she murmured, "is for Ruth. This is for Samuel. This is for me." She mixed it carefully, sparingly, into dishes. A spoonful into the gravy, sprinkle into the pudding, a dusting into the pies. She stirred until the bitterness vanished beneath flavors. She stirred until the wooden spoon tapped against iron like a drumbeat. The breaking point was not loud. It was not violent. It was quiet. It was a girl stirring poison into food with steady hands. It was silence turned lethal. By midday, the kitchen was alive with smells: roast turkey, sweet molasses, buttery biscuits. The overseers laughed in the yard, sharpening knives, drinking from flasks. They had no idea, no suspicion, no fear. Sarah carried the dishes to the dining hall. Her face was calm, her eyes steady, her silence unbroken. She placed the turkey in the center, the pies at the end, the gravy steaming, the pudding warm. She did not cry. She did not tremble. She just served. 7 men sat down. 7 overseers, 7 names burned into her memory: Henry, Thomas, Wade, Elijah, Robert, Silas, John. They lifted their forks. They dug in, and Sarah stood in the shadows watching. The breaking point had passed. There was no turning back. The feast had begun. The reckoning waited. Thanksgiving night, 1848. The pine trees sway in the wind outside the plantation, their needles whispering like ghosts. The firelight from the great house flickers against the windows, shadows of men drinking, laughing, demanding more. Inside the kitchen, the air is thick with heat, smoke, grease, and expectation. The table is being set with roasted turkey, candied yams, cornbread, and pies. The overseers gather, 7 of them, their names heavy in Sarah's mind: Samuel, Richard, Thomas, Elijah, Jacob, Henry, William, each one a chain, each one a scar, each one a name she has whispered in the dark when the whip struck or the hunger bit deep. Sarah moves among the dishes quietly, her bare feet sliding across the worn wood floor. She doesn't cry. She doesn't shake. She doesn't falter. The stew ladle in her hand isn't for serving. It's for survival. The herbs she ground earlier weren't for flavor. They were for vengeance. Powdered roots, bitter leaves, a pinch of death hidden in warmth and spice. The kitchen smells of roasted flesh, sweet molasses, and iron, because Sarah's hands, though steady, still tremble faintly with the memory of iron shackles. She remembers her son Jacob taken in the night. She remembers her sister Dinah, whipped until her back looked like split bark. She remembers her husband Elijah, dragged to the fields and never returning. She remembers every detail, every name, every scream. The overseers sit. Their boots tap. Their laughter grows. They raise glasses. They tear bread. They call for Sarah by name, as if she is not flesh and blood, but a tool, a shadow. She obeys, silent, her eyes lowered. Not because she fears them, but because she knows what is about to happen. The first bowl is served to Samuel. He smirks at her, a cruel twist of the lips that once shouted for her punishment. He spoons it down unaware. Richard takes his, muttering about the work quotas. Thomas grabs a portion, his fat fingers dripping with gravy. Elijah gulps his drink, then digs in. Jacob laughs. Henry sings a crude song. William calls for more turkey. The night continues like ritual. Forks scrape, teeth tear, jaws grind. Sarah watches. One by one, their laughter shifts. First a cough, then a grunt. A face tightens. A hand grips the table edge. Richard slams his fist down, swearing the food is cursed. Thomas groans, clutching his stomach. Elijah's song turns into a choking gasp. The feast becomes chaos. Chairs crash to the floor. Plates shatter. Men stumble, clutching throats, retching, gasping for air. Sarah stands still, her hands clasped in front of her apron, eyes unblinking. She doesn't cry. She doesn't run. She doesn't smile either. She just watches. One for Jacob, one for Dinah, one for Elijah, one for every lash, one for every broken promise, one for every silent scream. The overseers collapse one after another, their boots kicking against the wood, their breath turning shallow. The great house, once filled with laughter, now echoes with groans and dying curses. The smell shifts, from roasted turkey and cinnamon to bile and iron, bitter and final. Samuel reaches for Sarah, his hand trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. She steps back, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "You thought I was nothing." But I remembered. I remembered every night. His hand falls, his eyes glaze. By midnight, the house is silent. Silent in a way it has never been, not because the overseers have finally left, but because they are gone forever. The wind rattles the shutters. The fire burns low. Sarah stands alone in the glow, her shadow long across the floor. She doesn't tremble. She doesn't pray. She just breathes. This was her reckoning. Dawn comes slow over Georgia. November light bleeding pale across the fields. The mist clings low, curling between the rows of cotton like smoke rising from an unseen fire. For once, the sound of the overseer's whips is absent. No voices shouting orders, no boots stomping the dirt, just silence. Heavy, unbroken silence. The slaves on the plantation wake uneasy. They whisper among themselves, glancing toward the great house. Its windows are dark, its doors shut tight. Even the dogs are restless, pacing with their tails low as if sensing the weight of death inside. Sarah sits in the kitchen still, her apron stained, her face calm. She has not slept. She has not eaten. She does not need to. All night she kept watch over the fallen overseers, their bodies sprawled across the dining room floor. Plates overturned, food uneaten, wine spilled like blood. 7 men who thought themselves untouchable, now silent as stone. When the sun rises higher, the master returns. He had spent the night at a neighboring estate, feasting and boasting. He enters the great house with laughter on his lips, but the laughter dies. The smell hits him first, bitter, sour, unmistakable. The air is thick with it. His eyes fall on the scene, and his skin drains pale. Samuel, Richard, Thomas, Elijah, Jacob, Henry, William, all gone. He stumbles back, clutching the doorframe, shouting for the slaves to come, to explain, to reveal. But they stand silent at the edge of the yard. They know and they do not speak. Only Sarah steps forward. Her face is still. Her eyes are steady. She does not bow. She does not plead. She simply says, "They are finished." The master roars, rage spilling from him like fire. He calls for ropes, for guns, for punishment. Sarah does not resist. She walks forward, her feet bare against the dirt, her back straight as if carrying no weight at all. They bind her wrists. They spit at her. They call her demon, witch, devil. But Sarah does not flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just walked. The news spreads fast, faster than the smoke from any fire. From one plantation to the next, from the fields to the kitchens, whispers of Sarah's act move like wind. Some call it madness. Others call it justice. Among the enslaved, it is something more. It is proof. Proof that the overseers can bleed. Proof that silence can break. Proof that memory can strike back. They drag Sarah to the courthouse in town. Crowds gather, faces twisted with fear and fascination. White men spit curses. White women clutch their children close. The slaves who manage to slip close enough watch with hidden fire in their eyes. The trial is short, too short. No defense is allowed. No words of hers are recorded except one. I remembered. That was her truth, her testimony, her sentence. The judge condemns her to death. The gallows are built at the edge of town, the rope swinging against the sky. Sarah is led forward. Her bare feet touch the rough wood steps. She does not falter. She does not stumble. She climbs as if each step is a choice. They place the rope around her neck. The crowd hushes, waiting for screams, for pleas. But Sarah gives them nothing. She lifts her chin, eyes on the horizon where the fields stretch endless, where the sun burns pale gold. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She just breathed. The lever is pulled. The rope snaps tight. And Sarah of Georgia is gone. But she is not gone. In the fields, her name is whispered at night. Sarah, Sarah, Sarah. In the cabins, mothers tell their children the story of the woman who poisoned 7 overseers during the Thanksgiving feast of 1848. Her act becomes legend, a fire carried in secret. They called it murder, but it was really memory. They called it madness, but it was really justice. They called her a slave, but she was really something more. The great house never feels whole again. The master hires new men, but the walls remember. The floors remember. The fields remember. Every Thanksgiving after, the feast is smaller, quieter, filled with suspicion. No laughter rings as loud. No fire burns as warm. And in the years that follow, when freedom finally comes, when chains finally break, Sarah's name rises again. A story told not just in Georgia, but beyond. A story of defiance, of reckoning, of one woman who turned the tools of survival into the instruments of vengeance. If this story lingers, it is because silence lingers. If this story burns, it is because memory burns. And if this story matters, it is because Sarah matters. This was not just a feast. This was not just poison. This was not just death. This was Sarah of Georgia, and this was her reckoning. If this story shook you, share it. If her name echoes in you, carry it. And don't forget to subscribe, so the memory continues, so the silence is broken, so the past is never forgotten.